Boys like you don't end up with girls like my daughter. You're a guest in this house, not a future. Remember that." Renata Voss said it quietly, which was worse than if she'd shouted. She was standing in the kitchen doorway of her Rosedale home. The kind of house that had been in a family long enough to stop looking like money and start looking like permanence. And she was holding a glass of sparkling water and watching Idris Osei the way a person watches something they've already decided to throw away. She said it quietly and smiled after, as if she'd only commented on the weather, and then she walked back into the dining room where her husband was laughing at something, and the dinner party was still going beautifully, and the chandelier was catching the light, and everything in the house was arranged to say, "This is a life you will never belong to." Idris was 22. He had been dating Renata's daughter, Cora Voss, for 7 months. He had come to that dinner wearing the best jacket he owned, and a pair of shoes he'd saved for, and a kind of careful hope he had not yet learned to be ashamed of. He went home that night on the subway with his hands in his lap, and the careful hope gone and something harder in its place. He told himself it was anger. It was, partly. But underneath the anger was the thing he did not let himself hold for very long, which was that she had said it so quietly, as if the truth of it were obvious, as if a person like him failing to understand his own limits was the only surprise. He did not tell Cora what her mother had said. Cora had spent the drive home talking about the risotto and whether she thought her father had seemed tired. She had not noticed him go quiet, or she had noticed and chosen the risotto. He was not sure which was worse. He broke up with her 3 weeks later. Cora cried. She said she didn't understand. He told her it wasn't about her, which was the most honest thing he could say without saying the part that would require her to choose between him and the woman who'd raised her. He was 22. He did not think she would choose him. He was probably right. He left Toronto 4 months after that. He came back on a Wednesday, 3.5 years later, in the passenger seat of a rented Civic with a coffee going cold in the cup holder and the 401 unwinding ahead of him the way it always had. Flat and gray and indifferent, the way the city was indifferent to who left and who came back and in what condition. He had a meeting in the financial district at 2 o'clock. He had a room booked at a hotel on King Street that was nicer than anything he'd stayed in when he lived here. He had a name that no one in Toronto had heard yet, which was exactly how he needed it. The company was called Northline. It was not his name on the door. That was the point. Idris Osei had built Northline in the 18 months after he left Toronto, in a borrowed office in Waterloo that smelled of old carpet and ambition. Working with 2 engineers he'd met in a graduate seminar he'd audited without registering because he couldn't afford the tuition. What they built was not glamorous and did not need to be. It was supply chain software, specifically a predictive logistics engine that solved a problem so precisely and so quietly that the first company to license it did so without understanding what they had. Then, a second company, then a freight consortium. Then an acquisition offer came in from a firm in Calgary, and Idris declined it, and the number they came back with was the kind of number that changes what a person's name means in a room. By the time he returned to Toronto, he had declined 2 more acquisition offers. His attorney, a meticulous woman from Brampton named Odette Channer, had structured the fund so cleanly that no single public record could connect Northline's holdings to Idris's name. The financial press had written twice about an unnamed private entity quietly accumulating commercial real estate debt across the Greater Toronto area. Nobody had managed to put a face to it. Idris had not planned to let them. The meeting at 2 o'clock was at the offices of Voss Properties. He had not set out to come back for them. That was the part he turned over the most in the years since. The way you turn a key that no longer opens anything, checking whether it was still real. He had left and built the thing, and built it well, and the Voss name had not been the reason, not exactly. But he had watched, the way a person watches a storm system from a distance, as Voss Properties moved through the same slow erosion that hits every over-leveraged family firm eventually. Bad bets on condo pre-construction. A commercial tower in Mississauga that went sideways. a flagship mixed-use development in Liberty Village that had been in receivership twice in 4 years and was currently sitting unfinished and hemorrhaging money. That last project was called the Ainsley. It was the project Renata Voss had staked the family's remaining credibility on. It was the soft seam in everything the family still owned. Northline held a significant position in the Ainsley's distressed debt. He had not engineered that. He told himself that clearly and often, in the way that honest people tell themselves the things they need to stay honest. The debt position had been an opportunity, and he had taken it, because taking good opportunities was the whole mechanism of how he'd built what he had. The fact that the opportunity had a Voss name attached was something he had noted and set beside, the way you set aside a thing that might matter later. He had always known it might matter later. The Voss Properties offices were on the 31st floor of a building in the financial district, the kind of floor that had a view of the lake on clear days, and this was a clear day, and Idris stood at the lobby elevators in a coat that had been made for him in Montreal and pressed the button and felt nothing he had not already prepared to feel. He was not there as himself. He was there as a consultant, retained by a firm Odette had incorporated for exactly this purpose, reviewing the Ainsley restructuring on behalf of stakeholders whose identities were disclosed to counsel only. He had a different name on the badge. He had a different phone. He wore the kind of forgettable professionalism that makes a man invisible in boardrooms, the same way a canvas jacket makes a man invisible on a construction site, because the world assigns people to categories and looks no further. He was in the Voss Properties offices for 4 days before he saw her. Cora Voss came around the corner of the open-plan floor on a Thursday morning, with a laptop under her arm and the flat, focused look of someone running 20 minutes behind, on a day that had already gone sideways. She had cut her hair. She looked older in the way that people look older when they've had to make real decisions. She was talking to someone over her shoulder and nearly walked into him and stopped herself at the last second, and laptop shifted and they both reached for it and their hands met on the corner of it for a moment before she caught it herself. "Sorry," she said, without looking up. Then she looked up. The silence lasted 3 seconds. He counted them. "Idris." Her voice was steady. He gave her credit for that. "Cora." He stepped back. He kept his face where he needed it. "I didn't know you worked here." It was not true. He had known exactly. "I run the Ainsley file," she said, "since January." She looked at his badge, read the consulting firm's name, did a calculation behind her eyes. "You're here for the restructuring, for the stakeholders." "Yes." She looked at him for another moment in a way that had too many things in it to be read quickly. Then someone called her name from the far end of the floor, and she shifted the laptop and said she'd see him later and walked away, and Idris turned back to the desk they'd given him, and sat down and told himself that the thing he'd just felt was tactical. It was not tactical. He had been honest enough with himself for 3 years to know when he was lying. He found the problem with the Ainsley file on his second day. It was not the problem he'd expected. He'd expected to find the familiar shape of family mismanagement. Optimistic projections held past the point of honesty. Decisions made by people whose loyalty to the name outweighed their competence. And that was there, yes, the way wallpaper is there before you start pulling. But behind it was something else. Someone on the construction management side had been running a billing scheme for the better part of a year. Double-invoiced contracts. Vendors who existed in the system but not in any trade registry. Payment approvals that routed through a single Derchinkshutter's sign-off without the secondary review the company's own policy required. The director was a man named Terrence Falk. He sat 3 offices down from Renata Voss and had been with the family firm for 11 years, and had Renata's complete and unexamined trust. Cora's name was on the Ainsley file. She was the project lead. If the billing scheme surfaced under regulatory review, the name on the file was the name the review would start with. Renata had given Cora the file the way a person gives someone the wheel of a car with a cracked axle without mentioning the crack, because Renata Voss did not read technical reports and had decided long ago that trust was the same as safety and that Terrence Falk was trusted. Idris sat with the numbers for a day. He told himself it changed nothing. He told himself he hadn't come here for this. He thought about what it would cost Cora when the Ainsley went into its next receivership and the auditors came in and found Terence Falk's work with her name above it. On the third evening, he left a document on the shared drive. It was filed under a folder name that looked like a routine working paper but wasn't. A clean breakdown of the discrepancies, dates, vendor registration numbers, invoice totals mapped against on-site permit records, the gap between them laid out so that the pattern could not be argued with. No cover note, no name. He told himself he would have done it for anyone. He was not sure he believed himself. She found it the next morning. He watched her from across the open-plan floor, watched her open the folder, watched her go still the way people go still when they understand that the ground they thought was solid has been something else entirely. She read it twice. She looked up and scanned the room, and her eyes went over him and away. And he understood she had not yet done the arithmetic. She did it by the afternoon. He was in the elevator lobby when she found him, the document printed and folded in her hand. And she waited until the other person in the lobby had gone, and then she stood in front of him with the look of someone who has decided to be precise. "This came from you," she said. "The document's accurate," he said. "That's what matters." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "Yes." She held the folder. She looked at the floor number above the elevator and then back at him. "Who do you actually work for, Idris?" "Right now," he said. "I'm looking out for the Ainsley file. The Ainsley file has my name on it. I know." She was quiet for a moment. The elevator opened and neither of them moved to take it. "I need a day," she said. "Take what you need." She took two. She came in early both mornings and stayed late, and he watched her, with the particular care of someone trying not to be seen watching, pull her own copies of the vendor contracts, run her own traces on the registration numbers, build the case from his document as a starting point and her own evidence as the structure. She was not taking his word for anything. He found that he respected her for it in a way that made his chest feel inconveniently full. On the third morning, she went to HR and legal and not to Renata. He heard about it an hour later from a colleague who thought it was office gossip. Cora had filed a formal report. She had named Terence Falk. She had attached documentation. She had done it without consulting her mother, which in the architecture of this family was not a small thing, and everyone on the floor knew it. By noon, Terence Falk had been suspended pending investigation. By 3 o'clock, Renata Voss had been told. By 4, the floor had that particular electric stillness that precedes a storm. Renata did not come to Cora. She came to the consultant's area. She stood at the edge of it in a cream blazer and a kind of controlled fury that looked, from a distance, identical to calm, and she asked to speak with whoever was leading the stakeholder review. She did not recognize him until he stood up. The pause she had, the moment of rearrangement behind her eyes, lasted slightly longer than she intended. He watched her run the calculation, the badge, the consulting firm, the document, the 3.5 years, and whatever she had been told had become of him. "This is your doing," she said, not a question. "The audit findings are Cora's," he said. "She did that work. I'm not talking about the audit." He waited. "I want to know who you're working for." Her voice was the same voice she'd used in that kitchen doorway in Rosedale, measured and certain and laced with the particular contempt that people use when they are frightened and will not admit it. "And I want to know what you think you're going to accomplish." "I'm going to finish the review," he said. "The same thing I was engaged to do." "By whom?" Still not a question. "That's disclosed to legal." She held his gaze for a long moment, and he held it back, and neither of them moved the way neither of them had moved in that kitchen doorway, and the difference was that he was not 22 anymore, and he was not wearing a jacket he'd saved for, and he had nothing she could make small. "You should know," he said, "that the entity I represent has a significant position in the Ainsley's debt structure. Whatever happens with this project happens with our involvement. I'd recommend Voss Properties engage with that as a reality rather than a problem." He said it evenly. He was not smiling. This was not the part for smiling. Renata left. She made calls. He knew this because Odette told him that evening that Voss Properties Council had been in touch to ask who Northline's principals were and had been given, correctly, nothing. What Idris did not know was what Renata did with the absence of information. What she did was construct a theory. She was not a stupid woman. That was the thing he had always had to give her, even when he did not want to give her anything. She had run a family firm for 20 years and survived things that should have ended it, and she had the instincts of someone who had been reading rooms her entire life. She had read this one mostly right. She understood that the consulting firm was a shell. She understood that the debt position was a threat. She understood that the man standing in her offices was not an errand boy. What she got wrong was the source. She decided he had been sent by a competitor, one of 2 development firms she'd had public disputes with over the past decade. She decided that Cora had been manipulated, that the document on the shared drive was a planted provocation, that her daughter's decision to file the report was the result of being used by someone who had engineered access through their personal history. She decided this because the alternative, that the boy from the kitchen doorway had walked back in owning a piece of her company, was an architecture her mind wouldn't hold. The decision made her reckless. She called an emergency meeting of the Voss Properties Board for the following Monday. She had spent the weekend on the phone and had gathered the votes she needed. The agenda, circulated Sunday evening, listed one item: removal of Cora Voss from the Ainsley file and suspension of her operating authority, pending review of her conduct in the Terrence Falk matter. She was dressing the removal in the language of governance. She was pulling the only lever she had left, which was the board she had assembled over 20 years, and which still moved when she told it to move. Cora called him Sunday night. Her voice was not shaking, but it had that quality of a wire pulled very tight. "She's calling it a performance review," Cora said. "She's convinced herself that I was used, that someone handed me the document to destabilize the Ainsley." "You built the case yourself," he said. "I know that. She doesn't believe it." A pause. "Idris, who are you actually here for?" He had told himself there would be a right time for this. He had told himself that for 3 months. He understood now, hearing her voice, that there had never been a right time, and that he had simply been a coward about it in the specific way that people are cowards when the truth has sharp edges. "I need to tell you something," he said. "I need to tell you all of it." She came to the hotel. She sat across from him at the small table by the window with the city lights below them, and he told her from the beginning. The Waterloo office, and the 2 engineers, and the logistics patent, and the fund, and the way the Ainsley debt had come into the portfolio, and the 3.5 years of it sitting there the way a stone sits at the bottom of water, present and heavy, and not going anywhere. He told her he had not come back for her specifically, and he told her that was true, and he told her she had been the thing he hadn't planned for, and that was also true. He told her he had left the document on the drive because he couldn't make himself not, and that was the truest thing he'd said in 3.5 years. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "The fund," she said. "Yes, you hold debt on the Ainsley. Significant debt. Yes, how significant ought. Enough that any restructuring requires our agreement." She looked at the window, at the lights. "You could have let it fall," she said. "The whole thing. You could have let the receivership happen and bought the ruins." "Yes. Why didn't you?" He looked at her. "You know why." She looked back at him. The careful distance she had kept all week, the professional courtesy, came apart in both directions, and what was left was just the 2 of them sitting at a small table with the truth between them for the first time. "You should have told me," she said, "the first day, in the elevator lobby. I know. You should have told me before you left it on the shared drive. I know. Instead, I went to HR and legal with your evidence while you were standing there knowing everything, and I knew nothing." She wasn't angry. She was precise. That was worse in its way. "I felt brave," she said. "I thought I was standing on my own." "You were," he said. "The document was a starting point. Everything you filed, you built. I watched you do it. That's not the same as knowing the floor plan of the room I was walking into." "No," he agreed. "It isn't, and I was wrong to let you walk in without it. I told myself I was protecting you from something complicated, and what I was actually doing was protecting myself from the conversation we're having now. She was quiet again. Outside the window, the lake was a dark line at the edge of the city. The board meeting is Monday, she said. I know, she has the votes. She doesn't, he said. She has 33% of the voting bloc. The fund holds enough of the debt structure to convert to voting equity under the terms of the original note. We haven't done it yet. He paused. I can be in that room Monday, if you want me there. She looked at him for a long time. What happens if you're there? The meeting changes, he said. What you're trying to do stops. And what do you get? Nothing I don't already have. He said it plainly. I'm not there to take anything. I'm there to stop her from taking something from you. Cora did not answer immediately. She looked at her hands. Then she said, Come to the meeting. The Voss Properties boardroom was on the same floor as Renata's office, a glass-walled room that looked out over the city the way everything in this building looked out over everything. From a height designed to make the looking feel like authority. Renata was already seated when Idris arrived with Odette behind him, and she had a particular arrangement to her stillness that told him she had been preparing for him since Sunday. She had dressed the room carefully. Her allies were seated early. The agenda was printed and placed. She saw him come in and something shifted in her expression that was not surprise exactly. She had decided she was ready for him, but was sharper than she'd intended. This is a closed meeting, she said. Mrs. Channer is counsel to a voting stakeholder, Idris said. He sat down at the table without being invited to. We have a right to be present. Odette opened her folio. She was very good at opening folio. She laid the documents in the order they needed to land and did not hurry. The entity I represent, Odette said, holds a convertible debt position in the Ainsley development that was exercised to voting equity at market open this morning. She placed the conversion notice on the table. The effective voting interest, as of today, is 38.6% of this company. That is the largest single voting bloc at this table. Renata's legal counsel, a man named Fowler, leaned over to read the document. The room had that particular silence that happens when people are recalculating. Mrs. Voss assembled a 33% block over the weekend. Odette continued. Under the company's own articles of incorporation, a simple majority is required to remove a director from operational authority. 33% is not a majority. It is not close to 1. She set down a second document. The resolution on the agenda today, removal of Cora Voss from the Ainsley file, fails for want of votes. I'd ask that the minutes reflect this and further reflect that the grounds cited for removal were the identification and reporting of an active billing fraud. That's not mismanagement. That's the only reason this company still has a project to discuss. Renata had not moved. She was very still in the way of a person who is choosing stillness over the alternative. One of the board members, an older man named Gilles Marcotte, who had known the family for decades, set down his copy of the conversion notice and looked across the table. Renata, he said slowly, who is this? Renata did not answer immediately. She was looking at Idris in a way she had not looked at him before, with the quality of someone finally seeing the actual shape of a thing they'd been describing in the dark by touch. Idris spoke. You made a call in a kitchen in Rosedale, he said. You told me what I was. You told me where I belonged, and then you closed the door. He did not raise his voice. There was no reason to raise it. I spent 3 years building something you told me wasn't possible for a person like me, and now I'm sitting in your boardroom with your own articles of incorporation telling you that the resolution fails. He paused. That's all this is. That's the whole of it. Renata looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her face that was not grace and was not apology and was not the clean admission that the story might want it to be. It was older and harder than any of those things. It was the look of a person who has organized their life around a set of certainties and is watching one of them come apart at its seams. I remember that night, she said. I know you do. I was protecting her. You were protecting a version of her that didn't need protecting, he said. And you were protecting yourself from an idea that made you uncomfortable. Those aren't the same thing. The room had become very quiet. Gilles Marcotte was looking at the table. Fowler was looking at his hands. The resolution fails, Odette said again, because the meeting still had to be a meeting. I'd recommend the board move on to the actual business, which is the Ainsley restructuring, the fraud investigation regarding the former director Falk, and the path to project completion. Renata said nothing. She did not leave. The measure of the woman was that she did not leave. The meeting went on for 2 hours. Cora presented the restructuring framework she'd been building for 6 weeks, the one Renata had not known about, the one her daughter had built in the hours before and after the official workday in the particular way of people who know that their only ground is the work itself. The board approved it. Gilles Marcotte moved the vote. It passed without drama. When the room emptied, Cora stayed at the table. So did Idris. So did Renata, at the far end, gathering her papers with the careful movements of someone who is not yet ready to have the conversation that is waiting for her. Cora looked at her mother. Then she did a thing that Idris had not expected. She walked down to the far end of the table and she sat down across from Renata, and she did not say anything for a while, and Renata did not say anything either. I reported Terence Falk because the fraud was real, Cora said. Not because someone told me to. I know, Renata said. The 2 words cost something. I'm going to finish the Ainsley. I'm going to do it with the restructuring framework I built. I know. Cora was quiet for a moment. I don't need you to be sorry, she said. I need you to stop deciding things for me. Renata looked at her daughter across the long boardroom table. She was 61 years old and had run a company through 2 recessions and a family through everything that families go through. And she had been wrong about some very fundamental things, and she was sitting in the evidence of that now, and she could not fold it away. All right, Renata said, very quietly. All right, it was not an apology. It was a beginning which takes longer to build than an apology, but is harder to tear down. Odette found Idris in the elevator lobby and handed him a document and said she'd courier the rest and left. Because Odette understood that there were moments that did not need a lawyer in them. Cora came out of the boardroom 5 minutes later. She stood next to him and they watched the elevator numbers together for a moment. She's going to be difficult, Cora said. She knows how to be, he said. It's the other thing she's still learning. Cora looked at him, at the document in his hand. What's that? He handed it to her. It was a voting proxy, full assignment of Northline's 38.6% to Cora Voss, personal capacity for a term of 5 years renewable at her discretion. The debt Northline held, that it would keep, because he had earned it, and because a company with no responsible senior creditor was a company with a different set of problems. But the votes, the control, the weight of what he'd spent 3.5 years accumulating, he was putting it down in front of her. I'm not giving you the company, he said. I'm giving you the room to run it. There's a difference. She looked at the document for a long time. He did not fill the silence. You didn't have to do this, she said. I know. You built this for 3 years. I built it to put it somewhere that wasn't about revenge. He said, that took me longer to figure out than I'd like to admit. She looked up at him. I'm still angry about the shared drive. You should be. I need you to not make decisions about what I can handle. Yes, he said. Even when you think you know better. Especially then. She held the proxy. The elevator came, and neither of them moved to take it, and it went, and another came, and that one they took together, down into the lobby and out into the November afternoon with the wind off the lake, doing what November wind does in Toronto, which is to remind everyone that the city is not built for comfort, only for endurance, and that the endurance is its own kind of beauty. The Ainsley opened the following September. It was not a quiet opening. The project had been written about in the business press, first as a cautionary study in family firm mismanagement, then, as the completion date approached and the building began to take the shape it had always been meant to take, as something rarer, a turnaround. The kind of turnaround that requires someone to have done the unglamorous work in full, without recognition, for long enough that the recognition, when it came, felt like the natural result of something solid rather than the result of anything performed. Cora Voss ran the company. She ran it through decisions made in her own name and no one else's, and the board that had once assembled to remove her now called her to ask what she thought before anything significant moved. She had not arrived there by being carried. Idris had told her once, in the flat light of a borrowed office, that the difference between power given to you and power built by your hands was something you could feel in the bones of it, and that people who hadn't built it could not know what he meant, and that she would know. She did. Renata kept an office at Voss Properties. It had been Cora's condition and Renata's genuine surprise that her daughter had offered it when she didn't have to. It was a smaller office than she'd had. The window faced west instead of south. She used it 3 days a week, and she did not run anything, and she was learning, slowly, at the age of 61, that it was possible to be in a room without running it, and that this was not the diminishment she had feared, but something more like the first quiet she had found in decades. She had looked at Idris for a long time at the Ainsley opening, across a room full of people who now knew exactly who he was, and she had walked over to him with the gait of a woman who has decided to do something and will do it without theater. "I was wrong about you," she said. The same words she had come to in the boardroom, because they were the only true words she had for this. "I was wrong from the beginning." Idris looked at her. "You were afraid," he said, "not to be generous, but because it was accurate. You'd been hurt in a particular way, and you found a way to be afraid of me that looked like judgment. I understand how that happens." Renata held that for a moment. "That's more grace than I gave you. You gave Cora something," he said. "Whatever else you got wrong about her, you made her someone who wouldn't go quietly. She took on your entire board with a folder and her own evidence. You did that. You taught her that." He paused. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you the night in the kitchen didn't happen. It happened, but what came after it is real too." Renata nodded. One small, precise nod, and then she walked back into the party, which was full of people and noise and the particular warmth of a building that had been brought back from the edge of itself. And she did not look back, and he did not need her to. In the garden level of the Ainsley, where the landscaping had been finished in August, and the late-season plants were doing what late-season plants do in Toronto, holding on with the particular stubbornness of things that know winter is coming, and have decided not to be the first to go. Cora found him near the end of the evening. The city was doing its September thing, still warm enough to be outside, cool enough to remember that warmth is temporary. The sky, the specific dark blue that sits above a city that doesn't sleep so much as shift. 3.5 years ago, she said, "My mother told you something in a kitchen, yes. And you left and built something that brought you back here, yes. And now you're standing in the building that has your money in its walls and my name on its deeds and her mother in a small office with a west-facing window." He looked at her. "That's about right. What did you actually come back for?" She was not asking the way she had asked in the elevator lobby, sharp with suspicion. She was asking the way people ask when they already know the answer and want to hear some say it aloud. "I told myself revenge," he said. "For about 6 months, I actually believed it. Then the belief got complicated." He looked out at the garden, at the lights strung along the perimeter for the opening. "I came back because I couldn't finish what I'd built without understanding whether I'd built it to take something or to give something. Those aren't the same project. You can't run both at once. Eventually, you have to choose. Which did you choose?" He turned to look at her. "I'm standing in the garden," he said. "You tell me." She took his hand, and there was nothing left between them of the old distance. Not the kitchen in Rosedale, not the subway ride home, not the careful, forgettable professionalism of two people pretending not to know each other in a 31st floor office. Just two people standing in something they had both built, by different hands, over a longer time than either of them had planned, with the city humming on all sides and the lake invisible in the dark, but present the way the lake is always present in Toronto, as a kind of reminder that everything this city is sits at the edge of something vast and indifferent and beautiful, and that the building of anything worth keeping has always required choosing it anyway. Some people will tell you that a story like this is about success, about the arc from nothing to everything, about proving a person wrong, about the satisfaction of watching certainties collapse, and those things are in it. But that is not what stays with you. What stays is the moment a person decides what they built is for. Not the building, the deciding, because most of us spend years accumulating things, credentials, distance, the kind of quiet hurt that hardens into motivation, and we do not always stop to ask whether what we've been carrying is a weapon or a gift. It takes longer to tell the difference than anyone warns you, and sometimes you don't know until you're standing in a room with the choice in front of you and nothing left to hide behind. If someone has ever looked at you the way Renata looked at Idris in that kitchen, like you were a category and not a person, like your limits were already written and permanent, then you know what he carried out the door that night. And if you've ever built something from that, or tried to, then you know it can go two ways. The question is not whether you can make them see how wrong they were. Most of the time you can. The question is what you do with your hands once you've done it.